Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And it is my pleasure to present our speaker for today, Andy Urban. Andy's going to be talking to us in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and he's going to be talking about the Japanese experience at Seabrook Farms. Seabrook Farms was a sprawling kind of agricultural complex, and in honor of this month, in honor of the research he's doing for an upcoming book, he's going to be focusing on the Japanese experience there, as well as kind of the life for Japanese Americans during kind of the World War II era and a little bit beyond. So just a little bit more information about Andy. He is an associate professor of American Studies and History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. His research, scholarship, teaching, and public humanities work focus on labor, migration, and public memory. Andy's current book project explores the history of Seabrook Farms, an agribusiness in southern New Jersey that recruited and employed incarcerated Japanese Americans, guest workers from the British West Indies, migrant farm workers from the U.S. South, European displaced persons, and stateless Japanese Peruvians during the 1940s and 50s. His opinion pieces have appeared in the Journal of Asian American Studies, Journal of American Ethnic History, and Journal of American History. So welcome, Andy. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to our audience today. Before we jump into his fantastic presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. We will be taking your questions, so please feel free to send them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard, and we can certainly address them. There will be a survey available at the end of the webinar, so if you can please complete it. We always appreciate all the feedback that you can give us. And if you want some more information on Seabrook Farms, including the Japanese experience, Rutgers has created a fantastic digital exhibit, which is at the web address on the screen there. I will send that out in the chat once we get underway. So if you want to go take a look at that, we encourage you to explore that fantastic project that they're doing. And then one last thing I want to go over is just a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device, like a headset or earbuds, you can check to make sure that it's connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you have any issues, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that and that'll alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, there's the Q&A and the chat buttons. You can use either of them to get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to address them for you. So that is everything that I have for you. So it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Professor Urban.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for inviting me to speak this afternoon and giving me an opportunity to present essentially what is research in progress and what's beginning to become part of, as Andrew mentioned, this book in progress that I'm working on the history of Seabrook Farms. It even now has what I'm hoping will be a tentative title, or a eventual title, I should say, Processing History, Labor, Capitalism, and Memory at Seabrook Farms. And so it's really great to be here. I'm going to take about, I would guess about 45 minutes, making sure that we do have enough time for question and answer, and so that I can field any questions about what I'm going to discuss today, but also the larger project and my work on Seabrook Farms. Maybe the last thing I'll mention just real quickly before I share my screen and dive into my slides that I have for today's presentation is that you should know, or some of you might know already, that New Jersey actually recently passed, and I apologize, I'm joining you from my apartment, and there's a fire engine going by, so there's a little bit of a distraction in the background. Pause and give it a section just for it to go down the block. Great. Thank you. I've been working closely with a number of groups. New Jersey passed just last year legislation that now mandates that Asian American and Pacific Islander studies be incorporated and made part of the K through 12 standard curriculum that New Jersey schools offer. And so if there's any teachers in the audience today who are interested in some of the efforts that are going on to provide resources, provide lesson plans to accomplish that, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Great. Uh, so I'm going to talk today about, again, Japanese American experiences at Seabrook Farms, 1944 to 1947. Uh, and I want to begin just with a map. As a historian, I think it's always good to have a geographic orientation, specifically to think about Seabrook Farms as a place, not only where food processing occurred, but also where growing of produce for that processing took place. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But if any of you are familiar with the frozen foods industry today, that's not always the case. Those two operations are not always proximate to each other anymore. So Seabrook Farms, when it was in operation, it's no longer in operation. It was located about 5 miles north of Bridgeton, New Jersey, in Upper Deerfield Township. That's about 30 miles, give or take, as the crow flies, south of Philadelphia. It's in Cumberland County. This is a really rural part of New Jersey. Uh, it was incorporated in 1913. It was founded by Charles Franklin Seabrook, or C.F. Seabrook, as he went by. In its first iteration, Seabrook Farms was an industrial truck farm. And what that means in terms of agriculture is that in its initial days, Seabrook Farms grew fresh produce, typically to sell for wholesalers in places like New York or Philadelphia. Sometimes it sold to larger restaurants. And this was really about using new technologies to make available produce, vegetables, usually, although Seabrook Farms also did a business in strawberries and had fruit orchards as well. And it wanted to compete against Western growers, as this early company publication that I'm showing you on the screen indicates, right? Typically by December, January, if you were a restaurant in New York City and you wanted to provide customers with lettuce, right, you had to rely on produce grown in California. In some cases, although this was usually later, in Florida. And you had to be reliant on this long distance trucking. It came at quite a cost. Seabrook Farms introduced greenhouses in the 19 teens and 1920s, right? So that it could get lettuce to New York City and charge a high premium, but still less than what the California growers. It was one of the first farms in the United States to use overhead irrigation that CF had observed firsthand during a trip to Denmark. As a boy, that he then brought back to the US and introduced on a widespread usage on his own farms. And it used intense fertilization at a kind of industrial scale that most farmers weren't at that point. And this is how it kind of made its name. In fact, C.F. Seabrook gained the nickname the Henry Ford of agriculture, as one of, again, this first industrial truck farmers who was also issuing shares of the company on Wall Street, right? And also inviting financialization in farming in order to grow and expand operations. And again, some of this goes on now, right? We're more commonly aware of these practices, but at least in the 19 teens and 1920s, these were all kind of novel ways of thinking about how you could run an agribusiness or a farming operation. Nonetheless, despite all of this, the company overexpands, it takes on too much debt. And in 1924, it actually goes in receivership, and a Wall Street firm ousts CF as director, and he's forced to essentially give up control of his company. He repurchases farmlands that he's given up in 1929, right before the start of the Great Depression, and along with a cannery. And I should note, right, Seabrook Farms becomes a food processing industry by the early 1940s. Basically, all of what it's growing is going towards processing. So during this period, it's transitioning from a truck farm to a processing and canning and frozen goods agribusiness. In 1930, C.F. Seabrook reaches an agreement with Clarence Birdseye and General Foods to begin quick freezing for the Birdseye brand. So initially, Seabrook Farms is also a packer. It doesn't have its own private brand of vegetables and frozen foods, again, until the late 1940s, mid 1940s. 1942 to 1945, the company will undergo massive expansion as we enter a period where essentially the US economy is a planned or a command economy, right? There's rationing of consumer goods like canned and frozen foods. There's price controls on how much retailers can sell them for. There's strict regulations regarding production, especially when it comes to canning, because materials like tin, right, are needed for the wartime effort. And so Seabrook Farms, during all of this, nonetheless, does quite well. It wins a number of contracts to produce frozen foods for Birdseye in particular, and it expands enormously. By 1954, it's really reached the kind of heyday period of the company. That's when we see this kind of revolution in what will become the frozen foods industry, through transportation, through warehousing, through things, again, we tend to take for granted today, but as I'm studying this, I'm kind of learning about in interesting ways. For instance, it's not until really the 1950s that you see the first transparent self-service freezing containers at chain store grocery markets, which becomes kind of essential if you're selling frozen foods for, making sure you can actually get your product to the consumer, right? And this is when Seabrook Farms will also really invest heavily in its own brand of frozen foods, and spend millions of dollars on advertising, exploring new ways of marketing, and so forth. And I should say I'm giving you a kind of very quick and shortened version of all this because I do want to shift my attention to Japanese American experiences at the company. But this is part of what I'm researching for this larger book project, which hopefully will be published in 2026 if all goes well. During its heyday, Seabrook Farms employs more than 7,000 workers in its fields, plant, transportation, and warehouse divisions, as well as its sales offices and various managerial positions. It cultivates directly approximately 18,000 acres of land in New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and purchases produce from another 500, if not more, farmers who are cultivating themselves another 25,000 acres of land, right? So in total, right, it's producing vegetables on about 50,000 acres of land. And all of these vegetables are going towards freezing by the 1950s. This arrangement with small local farmers is complicated and contentious in its own right. In addition to buying produce from these farmers, the company also lends them money, sometimes seed and equipment, right, and essentially serves as a creditor to them. Seabrook Farms is also a company town. Within the kind of larger framework of the company, there's a separate independently owned corporation that's owned by CF, the founder, that leases more than 1,000 units of housing to its workers, right? And you have to be a worker at Seabrook Farms to actually live in these dwellings. The company also runs cafeterias. It has its own store or commissary. It has an infirmary or hospital. Keep in mind, right? This is industrial work with assembly lines, with steam and other kind of parts of the industrial processing that can make it quite dangerous work at times. It has its own police force. It has a public elementary school on its property, right? And so kind of experiences at this company are not just ones of labor, but of a much kind of broader social experience. This is a picture from 1955, a famous Life magazine publication, giving you a sense of that industrial process, right? These are women, and women were primarily employed in these positions on the vegetable sorting line, right? And so as Seabrook Farms was preparing frozen vegetables, not only for its own brand, but for other brands that it packed for as well, it sorted carrots, corn, peas, as you can see here, into different grades or standards, right? So that they could then be assigned to the proper box, the proper label put on, so the good could then be moved into its warehouse. And then one of actually Seabrook Farms' trucks, so it has its own transportation fleet, could say drive it to the local A&P anywhere within 13 states that reached from Michigan to Maine by the mid-1950s. just a couple more images that I wanted to share before I go into the Japanese American history more specifically. Again, I'm fascinated with all of this because, again, I was born when frozen foods were kind of already naturalized as part of maybe what we could call a kind of American diet, right? It was already understood by the late 1970s when I was born as a very kind of convenient and efficient product that busy people could use to feed their families, right? Easily. This wasn't the case in the 1950s, right? The product really had to be imagined as this new consumer good, right? So here you could see this advertisement marketing how you couldn't grow them fresher in your own backyard. As scholars of processed foods have explored, right? One of the anxieties around frozen foods and canned goods was that somehow the vegetable itself would be adulterated or corrupted during the processing. So companies like Seabrook Farms, of course, leaned into heavily this kind of idea that this actually preserved the nutrition, the freshness. As the other ad in gender terms, right, kind of alludes to, by the late 1950s, Seabrook Farms was latching onto this marketing idea that this was a product that was going to be especially coveted by women who had entered the wage workforce, right, and were working outside the home, but often still had obligations, the so-called second shift they had to perform when they came home to their own households of putting food on the plate quickly for their families, right? And so one of the product innovations that Seabrook Farms was at the forefront and the vanguard of in the 1950s, in 1958 specifically, was the Mylar boil in the bag pouch, where for the first time you didn't even need to empty the contents out of a bag into a steam or a pot of boiling water, but you could put the bag in itself in a boiling pot of water, and voila, 13 minutes later, have not only maybe spinach or peas, but increasingly frozen foods, right? Creamed spinach or beef stroganoff, as Seabrook Farm sold. Goods that involved, additional levels of processing. All right. And again, in the question and answer period, I'm happy to talk more about that dimension of Seabrook Farms, which, as you can probably gather, is going to be an important part of my book. But let's think about the Japanese American experience at Seabrook Farms, right? And I want to go back a little bit further, even. I don't know how familiar everyone is with the history of Japanese American incarceration more broadly. So I want to walk you through, I think, some important building blocks for having a critical understanding of this period and what exactly happened, what exactly occurred, right? So we'll start with Executive Order 9066, which is issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942. So roughly 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan. And basically what it decrees is that under the president's wartime powers, right, and this is a concept that actually dates back all the way to the 1790s when it's written into the Alien and Sedition Acts and other laws, that the president will have kind of extraordinary powers during a time of war. President Roosevelt authorizes the military, and I'm going to use the language that these official documents use, an evacuation of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, right? And as a number of historians have pointed out, right, this is euphemistic language, and evacuation makes it almost seem as if Japanese Americans chose to leave the West Coast, right? They were given basically a couple months to do so, and then they were forced or compelled to, or otherwise they could be arrested and detained. Approximately 62% of the estimated 120,000 incarcerated individuals are Nisei. And so when I use the term Nisei, I'm referring to American-born US citizens of Japanese descent, right? So 62% of that 120,000 figure are actual American citizens vis-a-vis their birthright citizenship and birth on US soil. The remainder are Isseis, or Issei. That term refers to Japanese immigrants. Something that's important to keep in mind with this group is that until 1952, when Congress passes the Naturalization Act of 1952, Asian immigrants are prohibited and barred from naturalizing and becoming American citizens. That dates all the way back to the 1870 Naturalization Act, right? So again, there's this period from 1870 to 1952 where congressional and federal statute is very clear. Asian immigrants are barred from becoming citizens. So I want to point that out, right? Because even though, again, we're talking about 38% who aren't citizens, some of those individuals had been in the US for 30, 40 years, right? And were legally prohibited from becoming citizens. It wasn't because they didn't desire to or want to. Neither the Nisei or Issei who were incarcerated in War Relocation Authority camps, and the WRA is the federal agency that's created in the Department of Interior to administer the evacuation, the incarceration of Japanese Americans. They're never charged with any specific crimes, right? There's no due process, there's no hearings or court cases, right? And as historian Mei Nai has argued, she labels this the production of Japanese American or Nisei alien citizenship, right? So even though these are individuals who are US citizens and should be protected by the US Constitution and have all of the, defenses and protections afforded, including due process, right? A right to a trial before your liberty is taken away. None of that ever occurs, right? And what Mei Nai argues is that their alienness, right, defined in racialized terms, the fact that they're descendants of a group of immigrants who can't become citizens because even though they're born in the US and grow up speaking English and going to American schools, right, they're still seen as not fully American, right? She calls this alien citizenship. It's one of these contradictions that exist in this kind of ideal of the United States more generally, right? The equal distribution of rights to all citizens. Because of the incarceration, there's massive loss of assets, property, income, and earning potential. These figures are hard to give with any precise precision, right? But some historians have estimated that basically 75% of all the accumulated worth that the Nikkei community, and in the Nikkei community is just the term that combines the Nisei and the Issei, that 75% of their total value was wiped out. From 1943 onwards, roughly 35,000 incarcerated Nikkei, after successfully completing the application for leave clearance, and I'll come back to that particular document in just a second, and proving their, quote, loyalty, become eligible for resettlement outside of the camps in new homes, in new working arrangements, right? So this is what essentially puts in place what will lead Japanese Americans to Seabrook Farms in New Jersey. As you probably notice, I'm using the term incarceration rather than maybe the more familiar term to some, internment. I'm doing that very consciously and specifically. Internment in legal terms refers to the detention of immigrants or aliens from belligerent nations that which the US is at war. In other words, Japanese Issei could be qualified as enemy aliens for internment. Germans and Italians were sometimes. And if you were subject to internment after December 1941, you were sent to actually different camps or facilities altogether, right? So some of the more notable ones on the screen, you can see Fort Lincoln in North Dakota, Fort Missoula in Montana. There's a camp in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Crystal City in Texas, which I'll talk a little bit more about. These camps are run by the Department of Justice and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They're not run by the War Relocation Authority. The War Relocation Authority runs what they call 10 evacuation centers or relocation centers as well. They sometimes use those language. These are jails. Sometimes they're referred to actually as concentration camps, as well by both Japanese Americans, but also by the federal authorities within the War Relocation Authority. These 10 camps are located at Manzanar in Inyo County, California, Poston in Arizona, Gila River in Arizona, Granada in Colorado, Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, and Hart Mountain in Wisconsin. Wisconsin, Wyoming, Tule Lake in California, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more as well, and then Rower and Jerome in Arkansas. And those are the two camps that are the farthest east. Most of the camps are in really arid desert areas of the interior Mountain West. And the camps are also viewed for labor purposes, right? They're seen as sites, even from the very beginning, where you can lease workers out to, say, beet farmers in Colorado who are facing shortages brought on by this mass migration of workers from agriculture into defense industry jobs, into manufacturing. There's a myth that surrounds Seabrook Farms, right? And this is kind of at the center of my book project and something I've been working very closely with the Seabrook Educational and Cultural Center, the museum that's in some ways now the kind of custodian of Seabrook Farms' public memory, its public history. The myth, I would argue, and again, like all myths, right, this isn't entirely incorrect or entirely based on fiction, right, but takes certain liberties in terms of what it includes, what it omits. The myth is that Japanese Americans eagerly resettled in New Jersey after leaving the camps where they were being detained and embraced the opportunity for a new start and to live and work in a place where they could celebrate their heritage without prejudice or discrimination. In some ways, the history that I'm uncovering, that I'm really beginning to kind of work through in my own research and writing, is that the recruitment of Issei and Nisei workers was a highly coordinated program where Seabrook Farms, a prominent wartime agricultural producer, specifically sought out a captive workforce, right? Literally workers who had very few choices as to where they could go, where they could essentially, exchange their labor power for wages, that it was able to employ and sponsor and house because of its limited freedom, and that this was actually specifically part of a strategy that Seabrook Farms pursued to avoid having to promote Black workers into unionized plant positions. And in this regard, Seabrook Farms wasn't isolated, right? This is a kind of tension that plays out throughout the United States in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis as well, where resettled Japanese Americans are inserted into urban labor markets in jobs that are considered the least desirable and lowest paying, and immediately in many respects become the direct competitors with Black migrant labor that has kind of relocated during the war for economic reasons. At Seabrook Farms, there's a kind of added twist to all of this. The first Japanese Americans who begin arriving in 1944 are offered housing that has newly been built for the company by the Federal Public Housing Authority at the cost of about $2 million on Seabrook Farms property, right? And this actually gets like some of Seabrook Farms' local business competitors absolutely riled up and furious. For example, there's a PJ Ritter, which is a well-known canning company in Bridgeton, who says, why is the federal government not building housing for our workers? And it's part of this kind of way in which the company has very kind of clever techniques of leveraging federal resources to grow its business. These houses are actually really high standard for the time, certainly in comparison to what Japanese Americans are leaving in camps like Manzanar and Gila River and others, where they're living in barracks that have very little in the way of privacy. And there's about 100 family units that house 900 workers in the end. And some of those units, or about half of them, were meant to go to Black migrant workers. And the company basically backs out of this agreement and hands it over to the Japanese Americans who are arriving instead. And it becomes not only a kind of unfair distribution of government resources within the universe of the company, it's even more contentious in a sense because it becomes kind of the main recruitment tool that the company uses to bring Japanese Americans to New Jersey, right? The promise of newly built family housing that has its own private bathrooms and kitchens, and that can accommodate large families in ways that the housing markets in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis really aren't set up to do at that time. By December 31st, 1945, there are more than 1,700 Nikkei individuals living at Seabrook Farms, with approximately 1,000 workers employed by the company on a regular basis, right? And again, this gives you a sense of the kind of family composition of this migration, right? The prevalence of large families with dependents. And by the end of the war, especially, Seabrook Farms has really become a destination, not only for larger families, but especially for families with elderly members, those who have lost most of their property or possessions on the West Coast, and therefore have little to return to. And I should note, right, it's not actually until January 1945 that camp detainees become eligible to return to the evacuation zone, the roughly 1,000-mile stretch of land stretching from the Pacific Ocean inwards or interior that has been evacuated since February 1942. And again, this is the demographic that Seabrook Farms is really bringing to to New Jersey, especially by 1945. And then after this, it adds these other populations as well, which I want to talk about because they're, in a sense, even more unique to this history of Japanese Nikkei incarceration, right? But also speak to Seabrook Farms' willingness to employ unfree, imprisoned labor. So in August 1946, and I'm going to come back to Japanese Peruvians a bit more in a second, 180 Japanese Peruvians are also sent to Seabrook Farms as paroled illegal aliens. I'll explain how we arrive at this terminology in just a moment. And then in October 1946, another 296 renunciants, Japanese American individuals, Nisei, who have renounced their US citizenship, are sent to Seabrook Farms under what's called relaxed internment as enemy aliens. And again, I'm going to get into some of this in a little bit more detail in just a second. Japanese Peruvians. Who are Japanese Peruvians? I wanted to share this firsthand testimony from Jinzo Morono, one of the Japanese Peruvian individuals who end up at Seabrook Farms, to kind of share with you this broader history. But just to give you a little bit of background first, Japanese Peruvians belong to a population of roughly 2,500 Japanese Latin Americans, so Japanese immigrants to countries like Peru, Panama, Colombia, who, as a result of a conference in Brazil, although ironically, Brazil itself never incarcerated its own Japanese population, nonetheless, as a result of this conference in 1942, Peru, Panama, and a number of other countries agreed to detain and arrest Japanese immigrants in their nations and actually send them to the United States for internment or imprisonment for the remainder of the Second World War. This occurs. Most Japanese Peruvians in 1945 are barred the ability to go back to Peru at the end of the war. Peru simply says, we refuse to take them back. Many are then sent to Japan. They're deported. But a group of about 300 to 500 hire a lawyer by the name of Wayne Collins and essentially pursue a legal case saying that it's unfair to classify them as illegal aliens who have entered the United States illegally and therefore need to be deported to Japan because they were brought to the United States against their will. In the course of all of this occurring, roughly 300 Japanese Peruvians are paroled to Seabrook Farms and given an opportunity to work while their legal cases are pending. And it's really not until 1948 that Japanese Peruvians become eligible to stay in the United States and therefore also eligible to leave Seabrook Farms if they so choose. Getting back to Morono, a group of Japanese Peruvians just end up staying in New Jersey for the remainder of their lives, having kids there. In fact, Morono's son would go on to be a star football player at Lehigh College, and he's retired now, a prominent executive at Chase Bank. But in 1981, Jinzo Morono went before the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, essentially to testify about what he went through. And I want to read a little bit of it. On Sunday, January 6, 1943, my wife, 4-year-old daughter, and infant son spent the afternoon at a Peruvian seaside resort with the family of my business partner. Around 7 p.m., after having dinner together, we drove to my partner's home where 2 Peruvian men in plain clothes were waiting for him to return. The 2 men asked for my partner, who promptly identified himself. They explained that by order of the United States, my partner was to accompany them. He entered their car and they drove off. About 1 hour later, the same situation happened to me. And Japanese Peruvians, right, really spoke of this as a kidnapping, right? Again, agents showing on to them with no warning, no knowledge of an agreement having been reached between Peru and the United States, and being taken away, separated from their family. In some cases, families were allowed to voluntarily depart Peru to reunite with the mainly men who were rounded up in these initial detentions. But in other instances, there were 5-6 years where men and their children, their wives were completely separated. Morono goes on to say, during the peak harvest season at Seabrook Farms, we were required to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because we were classified as illegal aliens by the United States Immigration Office, we had to pay a significantly higher income tax than US citizens. So Japanese Peruvian workers, as a condition of their parole, had to pay a 30% tax to Seabrook Farms. The company argued that as illegal aliens, they had to do this for federal tax income considerations. To be quite frank, it was just a kind of ploy to take the money by the company, to the best I can understand. I could not support my family of 5 on my income alone. As a result, my wife had to go to work also, leaving the care of our 2-year-old camp-born son to a child care center, right? And these are some of the more kind of traumatic histories that come out of the Seabrook Farms experience for different groups, especially for groups, I'll say again, right, whose kind of stories haven't been foregrounded as part of the public memory of this company, of this place. We struggled for over 30 years to provide for our family and educate our 3 children. During that time, with the exception of our youngest son, who is a natural-born US citizen, we have all become naturalized citizens. We are all very proud to be Americans of Japanese ancestry. However, we cannot ignore the injustice that was done to us. And in fact, right, a really interesting thing that's not really well known is, again, this is testimony in 1981. In 1988, Congress will pass the Civil Liberties Act. President Reagan will sign it into law, and it provides for $20,000 in redress money to any survivors of this experience. However, it's only made available to Japanese Americans, to Nisei and Issei, not to Japanese Peruvians or to Japanese Latin Americans. It's only much later in the early 2000s, due to a collective action lawsuit, that there's a settlement where Japanese Peruvians will be paid $5,000, right? So, despite what Moreno's saying here, there never really is kind of the same justice. And again, some Japanese Americans would absolutely dispute whether the $20,000 was sufficient justice. But with Japanese Peruvians, it's even a kind of lesser sum and none of the same formal official recognition either. So who are the renunciants at Seabrook Farms? These individuals who gave up their U.S. citizenship during the Second World War. This stems back to the application for leave clearance that was introduced in 1943. There's two key questions that are administered to all of the 120,000 or so individuals who are now detained in these WRA-run camps. The first question, question 27, is, will men serve in the military and will women serve in the auxiliary forces or in auxiliary roles as part of a kind of war effort, right? And keep in mind, or I'll introduce here, that Japanese Americans, Nisei, are actually not eligible at this point to serve in the US military or to be conscripted for the US military. They're actually classified, despite being American citizens, as 4C, which categorizes them as enemy aliens, right? At the lobbying of the Japanese American Citizens League and a number of other organizations, this has changed beginning in 1944. Question 28 asks, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization? These questions are complicated. The first one is asking people who have now been detained for a year without any due process or charges brought against them, whether they feel up for kind of serving or contributing their patriotic duty to the nation, even if at the time they can't actually do this, and this is kind of a theoretical premise moving forward, right? And so many say no, not necessarily because they actively despise the United States or because they're pro-Japanese, right? Because they feel, in a sense, betrayed. They feel as if their civil rights have been violated. As for question 28, for Japanese Americans, for the Nisei, for many of them, this is insulting, right? Why are they alone being asked to forswear allegiance to a foreign government, right? Or German Americans being asked that question? Or Italian Americans being asked that question? No. For Issei, it's confusing. They can't at this time naturalize and become American citizens. So if they give up their Japanese citizenship, right, it risks maybe rendering them stateless, right? And so there's a lot of complicated factors that surround these questions. But in essence, what happens is that if you say no to question 27 and question 28, you're summoned to a hearing, you're allowed to clarify yourself. But if you stick with those answers, from the summer of 1943, basically until March 1946, when Tule Lake Camp in northeastern California is closed, this camp will operate as a segregated center or camp for disloyal Nikkei. And it becomes a place where many who came in with, sort of grievances against the US or, civil protest, in some ways become even more radicalized against the United States. There's a strong cohort of various Japanese nationalist movements within this camp and so forth. On July 1st, 1944, Congress passes a Denaturalization Act, which removes existing statutory provisions barring citizens from renouncing their citizenship during the times of war. The 1944 Act, and this will become crucial in subsequent legal cases, does require that citizenship be forfeited voluntarily. Between March 22nd and May 5th, 1945, the Office of the U.S. Attorney General reviews and approves 5,049 renunciation applications. So again, these are U.S. citizens who are now formally petitioning the Department of Justice to renounce their birthright American citizenship. And again, the motives and reasons for doing so are quite complicated. Some people believe that this is the only way they can stay together with Issei family members who they think are going to be deported to Japan at the end of the war. Others do so because they're tired of moving. Some do so as a form of protest because they don't want to leave the camps and be resettled in places they believe that are going to be hostile. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of rumors circulating through these camps. These are pretty tense, anarchic places at this point, especially Tule Lake, because of its kind of history. And so this is why people renounce. Some do so because, again, they've given up on the US. I'm not going to kind of soft pedal it or say that those aren't like factors as well. And then on July 14th, 1945, President Truman issues proclamation number 2655, authorizing the removal of enemy aliens. 1,000 enemy aliens are then expatriated to Japan in 1945 and 1946. By September 1946, all but about 400 renunciants have been granted stays of deportation, so they're no longer threatened with active removal. But there's a group that are still being held incarcerated or interned at this point in Crystal City, Texas, and being told that basically, no, the government's going to move forward with all of its efforts to deport them. They too hire Wayne Collins, the same lawyer from California who's been representing the Japanese Peruvians, and they begin a legal battle to stay in the country. As enemy aliens, renunciants at Seabrook Farms, again, these are individuals arriving in now October 1946, given an opportunity to work for wages while their legal cases make their way through the system. They can only keep 20%, 20% of the wages they earn are withheld of the company, again, because they're classified in this case as enemy aliens. They're not allowed to leave company property without the permission of INS officials or for more than 6 hours. They can only work for Seabrook Farms, right? So in a couple of instances, workers are discovered doing side gigs as, say, auto mechanics in town, and they're sent back to Texas. They're removed. Relaxed internees at Seabrook Farms are assigned to dwellings that, quote, have no tables or chairs, malfunctioning toilets, and scarce hot water, right? So conditions in some case significantly worse than the camps that they've been living in. The straw mattresses that the company supplied for the 25 by 123 feet barracks, which each slept 50 men, were full of bed bugs, and they're maltreated or mistreated at the company as well. They're first fired, last hired when the company has its slack seasons. It's not until September 1947 that the deportation of renunciants is formally stopped. And at this point, these individuals who have been classified as enemy aliens become Native American aliens to kind of reflect their unique and idiosyncratic status. In many instances for the renunciants, including the ones who kind of pass through Seabrook Farms, it will take until the 1950s to fully recover their citizenship. And I want to give enough time for question and answer, so let me move quickly. One combination tended to lead to being in this group of, again, roughly 300 to 400 individuals that the Department of Justice was gung-ho in trying to deport right up until an adverse legal ruling, as I mentioned, in September 1947, prevented them from doing so. It tended to be individuals who had not only renounced their citizenship, but also resisted the draft, right? In other words, refused to fill in or complete their selective service papers. And those who were kibe, and kibe is a Japanese term that refers to individuals who were born in the US, but typically at a very young age, say around 5 to 10 years old, were sent to Japan for their education. This combination made you kind of fall into that group that was likely to really find it a kind of uphill battle to win a stay against deportation. Interestingly enough, some of somewhat famous individuals passed through this group and came to Seabrook Farms as well. This is Tsutomu Mirikatani, or Jimmy Mirikatani, who was a classically trained Japanese painter. There's a really wonderful documentary film called The Cats of Mirikatani that talks about his career and his life in the kind of shadow of his decision to renounce his United States citizenship. There was another individual, Henry Mitwer, who was the mixed race son of a white American sailor and a Japanese geisha, who again couldn't get Japanese citizenship because his dad wasn't Japanese, and therefore, was American citizenship by patrilineal descent, but didn't speak English, had never been in the U.S. And he actually put down roots at Seabrook Farms and ended up staying at least for 4 or 5 years. This is his daughter, Gretchen Mitver, in this picture, dressed up as a Native American as part of a Thanksgiving celebration at Seabrook Farms. And kind of, again, me wondering, at least knowing kind of this larger history, to what extent Henry's background, right, his decision to resist the draft, to renounce his citizenship, maybe was widely known or not known among his coworkers. I'm going to skip this just because we're short on time and it opens up a whole nother can of worms. But I wanted to leave you with this final thoughts, right? And these are some of the questions that are really kind of actively illuminating my work. How did the Japanese American community after World War II address histories of draft resistance and renunciation? And there's this interesting debate within the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the leading organization representing Nisei interests during the war, although certainly not everyone agrees with its more kind of conservative attitudes. The JACL kind of washes its hands of draft resistors and renunciants. It expels them from its organization. It refuses to support them in any of their legal cases. It's not until really 5 years, the last 5 years, 2019 and onward, that the JACL has finally kind of come to terms within its organization about its own exclusions of these members of this community and why their decisions to renounce their citizenship, to resist the draft, deserve to be maybe respected and understood rather than kind of condemned outright. For me as a historian, right, I'm really interested in this question. What does it mean to understand Seabrook Farms not as a place of new beginnings, but rather as an aggressive, expanding agribusiness that was eager to exploit various forms of unfree labor whenever and wherever possible, right? A very different narrative than this company that provided refuge. And then finally, how can the museum, the Seabrook Educational and Cultural Center, use new research and frameworks, right, including a focus on renunciants, to connect to new audiences, right? In other words, who needs to kind of hear and learn these histories, and who can use Seabrook Farms to maybe make sense of issues and concerns we're contending with in the present? And I'll leave it at that. And sorry, I went a little bit longer than I anticipated. I can probably, I can't get out of here. I'm trying to stop share. I've lost my cursor. Oh, there we go. Great. And yeah, I would love to take what we have in remaining time. Andrew, I don't know if there's a kind of, strict cutoff at 1, but I can certainly stay a couple more minutes afterwards if we need to have a little more time to get to questions. But thank you for your time and, yeah, allowing me to try to cover all of this information. So I'll shut up and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Andy. If anybody does have questions, please feel free, pop them in using the Q&A or the chat buttons, and we'll be happy to address them. Why did the United States kidnap Japanese Peruvians? Was it for the labor specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I would say as a labor historian, right, that kind of labor concerns were, always part of it. And actually, there's really a couple harrowing accounts from Japanese Peruvians who, during the journey to the United States, or I should say the mainland United States, were actually brought to the US controlled canal zone in Panama and assigned jobs like digging latrines in the jungle for the US military bases there. So yeah, labor was absolutely part of it. The reasoning that the US government and the State Department specifically gives is that it believes that, like Japanese immigrants in the US, Japanese immigrants in Peru are going to be this fifth column that, will undermine Peru as an ally against the Axis powers. And they don't think Peru has a kind of sufficient infrastructure and police force to, do the detention right. And so what they actually give Peru in exchange is, bargain discounts on US weapons. That's kind of the deal that's struck. And in turn, Peru kind of hands this population over. What Peru does not say, at least in 1942, is that it's not going to take this population back either, right? The US expects this just to be a kind of wartime detention. And Andrew, do you want to just moderate the questions? Because I see some are kind of
Yeah,
extended. You
that's
probably
fine.
have a better sense of the order, so I'll just defer to you on that. Yeah.
How many former Seabrook internees or their descendants have you interviewed?
I would say that most of the individuals who ended up who come to Seabrook Farms between, let's say, 1944 and 47, unfortunately, they've passed away at this point. What I have relied on is actually they did a series of oral histories. They did one round in like the mid 1980s, actually through like a New Jersey Historical Commission grant to this young Japanese American woman who had grown up in the community, but had like gone to graduate school. And so they're really fascinating because she was kind of an insider. And in 1980, the museum wasn't open. The museum opened in 1994. So those oral histories are really interesting to me because in some ways they're much more candid and open. You get another round of oral histories that are done after the museum's created in 1994, and they're interested and include lots of really great details. But in some ways, it's interesting as a historian because they conform more to this kind of, again, as I kind of argue, mythology that's beginning to emerge, right? Where Seabrook Farms can't be criticized because it was, this savior. And, history is complicated. And, not everybody believed that. But because, the dominant kind of voices in the museum were really sort of saying that, it became almost a kind of standardized narrative. I have done some oral histories, but it's been with some of the kids who were born at Seabrook Farms in 1950s and 1960s. Obviously not kids anymore, but also with descendants of a lot of the Black workers who were recruited to Seabrook Farms. And that's been a conscious effort not only by me but also by the Seabrook Educational and Cultural Center, because in some ways those voices aren't as well represented in the museum collections and archives.
Do you have a publisher for your book?
I don't actually. I'm in a lucky position, whereas a tenured professor, it's a little bit less of a kind of like I got to get this done or I'm going to lose my job situation. So I'm kind of taking my time, but I'm going to be approaching publishers like in the next couple of weeks. That's kind of my next task. But yeah, I'm hoping it'll probably be with a university publisher that nonetheless kind of tries to reach broader audiences. And I'm really hopeful that this will become a book that gets assigned to a lot of New Jersey history classes. It's exciting to do local history that is also what I would call a kind of global, far-reaching history, that touches on everything from the development of frozen foods in the 1950s to the, experience of Japanese Americans and incarceration and resettlement during the war. That, it kind of shows you that local history, and, no offense to George Washington, right? But in New Jersey, sometimes, right, it's all about George Washington slept here, right? Where we have all of these incredibly fascinating histories that, I want to get into the schools and I want to kind of introduce to our students.
How did the Japanese at Seabrook get along with non-Japanese who worked there during World War II and after?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to give you what I'll call kind of like provisional answers, because to be honest, it's something I'm still trying to work through in my own mind, because, there's not a singular experience is the short answer, right? But it's important to keep in mind that like C.F. Seabrook, that founder in particular, you know, I'm not like, again, I'm not like revealing anything that's not widely known by saying that like he was an anti-Black racist. He had he wrote things about how like he believed black workers should do field labor and white and Japanese Americans should be employed in his plants, right, doing the assembly line work, freezing vegetables, processing vegetables into canned goods, etc. And what that means is that also it's white and Japanese American workers who become eligible for what are by 1941 onwards unionized jobs, right? Because in 1941, Seabrook Farms recognizes Local 56 of the Amalgamated Meat Packers and Canners Union, and becomes a unionized shop. And Local 56 is not by no means the most radical union, but it still provides some protections and benefits. And so those benefits, those better paying jobs, kind of go exclusively to white and Nikkei workers, whereas black workers are discriminated and kept in the fields. So part of what I'm getting at is that there is a racial division of labor in the company that keeps different groups of workers segregated. Where workers tend to kind of come together is in the community house that is opened initially as part of that federal housing project I mentioned, but then is taken over by the company, as well as in the cafeterias where, various groups of workers congregate. And, there's mixed results, right? Some Japanese Americans become radicalized by their experiences, being introduced to the plight of like migrant farm workers who come up from Florida and Georgia every year and, sleep in some of the worst accommodations that you can find in rural southern New Jersey. Whereas others kind of develop a model minority myth. And some of you might be kind of familiar with this term, but it's, found in certain sectors of the post-war Japanese American community and to certain degrees the Chinese American community as well, where the argument is, well, Asian Americans are a model minority, unlike Black Americans, because they're industrious, they work hard, et cetera, right? And, I would denounce this strongly and try to, explain in great detail, right, the historical circumstances and factors that gave different groups different opportunities. But, that kind of racial belief has always been present, right, as part of our, sort of American language and understanding. Yep.
20,000 is almost insulting if you ask me. But to its credit, the FDR Museum in New Hyde Park actually has a wing featuring the history of the internment, which is something, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really great point, right? Because and I'm always kind of interested in what I would call these meta narratives, right? And you're absolutely correct. And a number of Japanese American survivors of these camps say the exact same thing. But what happens, interestingly, right, is that others kind of seize upon this, narrative. Well, they paid out 20,000 in 1988, so all is good and all is forgiven, right? And doesn't that demonstrate that like the United States makes mistakes and kind of recognizes its wrongs and moves on, and right, and in some ways it does a real serious disservice to the various complications that hopefully I kind of identified. Yep.
Was there a mix of African American migrant workers alongside the Japanese workers at Seabrook?
Yeah. I mean, so, I'm laughing and chuckling because I could probably, I could really go on and on about this. You all are catching me at a very good moment where I'm like doing a lot of writing and research and all the, sometimes when you're in academia and you have a busy schedule, like I got archival files like 4 years ago, and it was only this like 2 months ago I finally could look at them. And so, I have a lot of information, but let me give you a quick kind of overview of the labor force at Seabrook Farms more generally, because it brought in groups from all over the place, right? And I'll go from the kind of period of 1941 onwards, but in 1941 and 1942, it's recruiting mainly Black migrant farm workers from the U.S. South, so from Georgia, from Florida. And in 1942, the Farm Security Administration, which is a New Deal agency administered by the federal government, by the Department of Agriculture, actually opens what's called a mobile labor camp in May 1942. And this is essentially a temporary camp that can accommodate 1,000 workers during like the seasonal harvests. And it is all really seasonal because, I was saying to my wife just the other day, because if you've been to the supermarket, right, Jersey asparagus is fresh. And that's one of the things that Seabrook Farms grew to be canned and frozen. And, I'm reading all these documents and, asparagus basically shoots up if there's a warm day, right? You can't predict when the asparagus is going to be ready to harvest. So for the growers, it's always this really delicate balance, right? They don't want to have to like have a bunch of workers on hand that they need to then house when there's nothing to pick, but they need to have the workers ready and there for when the vegetables are coming up. And so the FSA essentially provides an 1,000-person camp where workers can congregate and then local growers can hire. But in 1943, actually, then it becomes a camp for Jamaican and Barbadian or workers from Barbados who come to the U.S. as, and these are Black workers who come as guest workers, right? And some of you might have heard of braceros, which are the Mexican guest workers in that program, which begins at the exact same time in 1943. But in New Jersey, it's mainly workers from the British West Indies, sometimes from the Bahamas as well. And they're put in the FSA camp, and actually they displace Black migrant workers from Florida and Georgia who are then moved to, less desirable and much, shoddier kind of privately owned camps, including some of these really horrible camps that Seabrook Farms runs and maintains. And I could go on about this, but the Department of Public Health gets involved, and the New Jersey Consumer League gets involved, and eventually the company's reprimanded, and it does have to kind of clean them up a bit. But and then moving on quickly, you have German POWs working at Seabrook Farms during the war, roughly 500. You have white migrant farm workers from Appalachia, from West Virginia and Tennessee and North Carolina coming to Seabrook Farms, and then finally in 1944, all of those groups kind of take a backseat to the Japanese. And then the last kind of large influx of workers, at least to plant jobs within, the factory, are actually European displaced persons who in 1949 and 1950 are recruited from camps in Germany. These are Estonians, Poles, Ukrainians, and Volksdeutsch. These are German-speaking ethnic minorities who essentially flee the Red Army as it's moving west at the end of the war and eventually end up in displaced persons camps in Germany. And so Seabrook Farms recruits about 1,000 workers from that source as well. It uses Puerto Rican migrant farm workers in the 50s. Again, right? I could go on, and this is why people call Seabrook Farms a global village, and they're not wrong in any respect. And it is an incredibly diverse place in New Jersey. What I would say I'm pushing back against, at least in my own research, is, how that diversity worked in practice. Was it all the kind of rainbows and good times, if you will, that the kind of company usually insisted it was? And the answer in short is no.
Did the neighboring communities know about the Japanese American workers? And if so, what was their reactions?
Yeah, these are really great questions. They did, yeah, and if you unfortunately, it's not really digitized. I think you need it's not freely digitized, I should say. You need a newspaper.com subscription, or if you're in Cumberland County, you can go to the Bridgeton Public Library or Cumberland Historical Society. But yeah, like the Bridgeton Evening News, this is what I'm getting at. They ran extensive kind of coverage of the arrival of the Japanese Americans. The short answer is, again, it's complicated, right? One of the things I'm discovering in really sort of unsavory terms, to be perfectly honest, is that Bridgeton, New Jersey, and the surrounding area was known as the Confederacy of New Jersey. It had a very active KKK. It affected Jim Crow segregation laws, not in education, but in a lot of other kind of areas of public life. In 1942, unarmed Black man had been shot on the streets of Bridgeton in the back, that type of stuff. And so, in some ways, the white population of Bridgeton, while no great kind of lovers of Japanese Americans, and, there were certainly racist incidents where, Japanese Americans were called derogatory terms, et cetera. on the other hand, they were considered a kind of welcome alternative to Black migrant workers who were, even less, seen in even less positive terms, I should say, by the kind of white population of Bridgeton and surrounding areas. So that was kind of part of it. And then the other issue was that Seabrook Farms was such a powerful employer, right, and owned so much property and had so much influence on all of the local governments and with all of the various state boards, et cetera. I mean, this was a powerful corporation, right? And an aggressive lobbyer of politicians, et cetera, on local, state, and federal levels across the board, right? So, CF Seabrook at one, basically said, look, I'm not going to tolerate racism towards Japanese Americans, never, issued any kind of edicts about Black workers in the same way. And, a lot of people just fell in line because they didn't want to, risk losing their own jobs or risk losing, the kind of access to various privileges that, the good standing with the company provided.
I don't see any more questions. Anything you would like to close with, Andy?
No, I mean, thank you so much for these wonderful questions and, for, listening to me talk about all of this. I'll just say again, yeah, stay tuned and, hopefully if all goes well, the book will be out in 2026. And, Andrew posted the link to an exhibit that I did with Rutgers students back in 2016. Some of my arguments and ideas about Seabrook Farms have been evolving as I've done more research and writing, but it still has a wonderful kind of array of images and videos and other articles and resources if any of you are teachers, for instance, and looking for things. And, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and thanks again.
Again, thank you so much, Professor Urban, and thank you everybody for attending today. Please feel free to check out the website. This program was recorded, so a link to the recording will be emailed to everybody. And again, if you have time, please complete the survey. We really appreciate all the feedback that you can give us. So everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.